Welcome back to the Magnolia Media Podcast. I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. And while today was a slow day in the news, the headlines about Joe Biden and his mental acuity simply won't stop. The White House seems to be caught in a doom loop as the ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos and President Joe Biden didn't go as smoothly as one would hope, nor did the debate, which was the reason for the interview. Biden has made less or fewer speeches and given less press conferences than any president in modern political history. It's as if the White House staff and those cabinet secretaries are sort of trying to hide him a little bit. And now, don't get me wrong. Anyone who's listened to this podcast knows that I am about as big a believer in President Biden as any pundit or anyone talking about politics online, on TV, on radio, wherever, in today's political ecosystem. However, it's becoming painfully clear that the White House is caught in this doom loop of constantly having to ask questions. If he's not coming off the ballot, then is he going to do X, Y, Z? Is he going to step down? Is there going to be a contested convention? Is this? It makes one's head simply spin. As Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary, is left up there by herself to swat away these questions, certainly at the direction of her boss. Now, moving on to what should actually happen. And my opinion on this has evolved. And I have to admit that I'm beginning to agree with the congresspeople who will come out and actually say President Biden probably does need to step down. Make room for new blood. Because, to be quite frank, almost anyone should be up at least 10 points against a convicted felon 34 times over, a man who was found liable for sexual assault in the E. Jean Carroll defamation lawsuit number 1, owes E. Jean Carroll $90 million in the second case against him, and owes the state of New York $400 million, closer to $500 million, because he'd been defrauding taxpayers in the state of New York for 30 or 40 years. The man is a con man, a liar, and frankly, a terrorist, as he was the one who incited the riot against the Capitol on January 6, 2021. A man who knew he had lost, but chose to take those actions anyway. And even though he's been illegally insulated by the Supreme Court for many of those crimes, while in office, President Biden might have to use some of his own leverage, some of his own newly granted powers. We as Americans, we as non-Trumplicans, non-Magadonians, do not want to hear, when asked by George Stephanopoulos on ABC News or anyone else of President Biden, what happens if you decide to stay in the race and lose. And in January of 2025, Biden is stepping down and Trump is taking his place. And he said that he will be satisfied knowing that he did all he could and gave it the old college try. Well, Joe, that's simply not going to work, because the Supreme Court has set the stage for fascism, this Christo-neo-fascist, twisted, demented form of politics that arose around the time Trump decided to throw his hat in the ring back in 2015, when he came down those tacky golden escalators in his tacky building on Fifth Avenue in New York. Trump Tower, the eyesore that it is, the eyesore that he is, has a real chance of being reelected, or elected rather for a second time, if we don't do something and do it quickly. Biden's talking about waiting until the convention before he has a challenger of some sort, and that would create complete chaos. We do not need a contested convention. We simply need for Joe Biden to back away from some of the comments he's been making as of late. The most recent line being laid on the Democratic Party is that not supporting President Biden is somehow racist because Biden has had such solid support from the African American community. And this is true. They have been an extremely loyal voting bloc for, well, all Democrats over the last, 60 years or so since political realignment occurred after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1964 by Lyndon B. Johnson, essentially creating a cesspool in the southeastern United States and single-party rule, until, of course, Democrats broke through in Georgia, taking both Senate seats. Democrat has taken the the governor's mansion in Kentucky. We had a Democratic governor in the state of North Carolina. We had a Democratic governor in the state of Louisiana. And all of this in just the past few years. Andy Beshear, of course, the governor of Kentucky, was even being tossed around as a potential candidate for president if the party can convince Joe Biden to step down. Tomorrow, if you're listening to this, it's going to be today, there will be a NATO summit held in the United States, and after which President Biden will have a gloves-off press conference. Certainly, there will be questions fired at him from all angles, and he has to sound clear. He has to sound concise, maybe a little bit angry, but in rhythm. No more of this smashing words together, this jumbled, mashed up, hard to understand answers like the ones he was giving George Stephanopoulos or during the debate that he was giving Jake Tapper and Dana Bash. By the way, Dana or Donna Bash, whatever her name is, or however she prefers to announce it, I really don't care. And Jake Tapper, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, and of course Biden didn't decide to enact the Insurrection Act and have him arrested instead of giving up power, because now, as president, you can do that, according to the Supreme Court of the United States. This far right-wing Christo-fascist court, at least it's 6 members who are beyond corrupt. We will not accept that. We cannot accept a Trump presidency. So saying you're going to go out and give it the good old college try is simply not enough, Joe. It's not enough. And this is coming from a man who truly loves you. Truly. But you're in a box. Again, the doom spiral has already begun. And to question whether it's racist to question your fitness for office, or whether or not you can beat Donald Trump. At this point, it does not appear you can. You trail in all 7 swing states, you trail in the national polls, and you're even causing states that were more or less guaranteed to go blue to now move into the lean blue category, and for states that were lean blue to move into the purple category. I mean, we can't be losing states like Minnesota or Virginia or New Hampshire or Nebraska 2nd to Dementia J convicted felon Donald Trump. We can't have that. So there may need to be a move made, and it does seem that any coherent Democrat, especially one with real name recognition like, Kamala Harris, who I would only assume would have black support because, she's half black, Joe. So knock off the nonsense about it being racist not to support you or not to understand why you're staying in the race or encourage you to stay in the race because you have strong support from black Americans. That's distasteful, to put it mildly. To say a Democratic candidate running for president has the support of African Americans is as true as saying that white people with 3 teeth, a third-grade education, and a stomach that pokes out from underneath their t-shirt that's 3 sizes too small support Donald Trump. It doesn't mean you're a racist. It's just putting out facts. Those people will support Republicans. African Americans in this country have largely supported Democratic candidates since political realignment. So, Maxine Waters and her defiant statements in New Orleans, night before last, saying that Joe Biden will be our nominee, might be words of sort of false bravado. Because again, every day until Biden has a 2-week stretch in which he does not mess up at all, in which the spotlight is solely on him and not on the convicted felon who owes the state of New York $500 million in back taxes and offered $1 billion to oil executives, or offered backroom deals to oil executives to raise him $1 billion, and just received a $50 million contribution from one of those extreme right-wing oil executives who don't care that this is probably the last 5-year stretch we have to do something about fossil fuels and begin cooling the earth before it becomes an unlivable place, before millions more people show up at the southern border escaping climate catastrophe. Because that's what's happening already around the world. Floods and hurricanes and typhoons. It has been insane. Even this year alone, just in the United States, we just dealt with hurricane in South Texas that's now moving up, and we'll surely get some rain from it, as we usually do with those big storms that blow up through the Gulf. They make their way across Mississippi, Alabama, and into Tennessee, where we get just absolute insane amounts of rain over a 2 or 3 day period. But this is happening more and more often. We're seeing more and more flooding. We're seeing a fire season that basically lasts all year in a state like California. Hell, we saw fires pop up in Siberia last year. When you think of Siberia, you don't think of wildfires. You think of hard snow and dirty Russia. But I digress. Again, it does seem that no matter what President Biden does at this point, he's going to be questioned on his mental acuity. Does he have Parkinson's disease? Is this perhaps why a Parkinson's specialist from Walter Reed has been coming to the White House? That Parkinson's specialist has been there 8 times between July of last year and March of this year. 8 visits. So why are they coming? Are they coming for one of the members of the White House staff? If so, it doesn't seem that would be a big deal to admit during a press conference if you're Karine Jean-Pierre. And of course, none of this was in Biden's physical, where he does get a neurological test and everything did seem to turn out okay. But Parkinson's is something totally different. And when you're approaching an elderly loved one who has something seriously wrong with them, like Parkinson's disease. I had a grandmother who raised me, was a mom who had vascular dementia, and it took some time to convince her that she needed to get some help. It wasn't until she slipped and fell a few times we were finally able to get her in front of a doctor who would do something about it, and to get her to accept that she was going to have to slow down. I mean, she didn't even want to give up her car keys, but it was something that had to happen, as the potential for an accident was just too high. Well, the potential for loss in this situation is just too high. The media is never going to put Donald Trump under the microscope he belongs under. They are never going to dissect him day in and day out the way they will what they expect to be a rational and intelligent presidential nominee from the Democratic side. And we have such a deep bench, from the governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, to Whitmer in Michigan, to Newsom in California, to Beshear, the governor of Kentucky. We have a deep, deep bench of people in which to turn to. It doesn't make sense to continue doing this to both the party and to yourself, President Biden, as the verbal beating continues from the press and the drumbeat from people like me, people like those on other political podcasts, Pod Save America, Pod Save the World, Keith Olbermann. Countdown with Keith Olbermann. There may not be a bigger Biden fan, Biden lover in the United States than Keith Olbermann, and even Keith is calling for you to step down, Mr. President. Again, we do this with nothing but love in our hearts, and we truly believe you deserve a spot on Mount Rushmore. Your one term that saved democracy, that stopped Donald Trump from having 2 consecutive terms when he would have absolutely destroyed American democracy and destroyed the lives of millions of Americans. You stopped him. You beat him soundly. You ran an excellent campaign, and you ran from the front. Again, in July of 2020, you were up by 9 points. You now trail by 9 points. It's not a coincidence. It's because people question, can an 85-year-old man handle the rigors of being president when you seem to be having so much trouble handling the rigors of being president at 81? Even the State of the Union, which gave us all hope that these questions would subside and there would be no reason for them. And they did subside, and suddenly the spotlight was being turned completely onto Donald Trump, as of course it should. However, your debate performance was so bad and so worrisome that we worry for your health. We worry that you'll spend the last days of your life dealing with the stresses of running the entire country. And why? Why, with a bench as deep as we have in the Democratic Party? Again, I can go through a list of senators who could easily be president. I could go through, of course, your vice president, Kamala Harris, who should be at the very top of that list of people who have the opportunity to be president of the United States. Of course, you'll be president of the United States through January 2025 anyway. So if you have to take one of those extreme actions just made legal by this illegitimate Christo-fascist Supreme Court, or at least the 6 conservative members are Christo-fascist extremists and illegitimate at that. Those who've taken bribes from Harlan Crow and Leonard Leo, you know those guys? They just made you king, by the way. So no matter what, you can make sure that this country ends up in safe hands come January of 2025. And if you step aside now and give Democrats, another Democrat, a real shot at winning this thing, I truly believe you'll be remembered fondly as any president in the last 75 years. Lyndon B. Johnson had, while he did a lot, he had Vietnam with which to contend. FDR, of course, got us through World War II, but his social programs rescued the country from the throes of the Great Depression. The Biden economy has been the best economy of the last 50 years. Today, again, we came very close to setting another record in the Dow Jones, another record in the S&P 500 and NASDAQ. Money is flowing freely in this country. Now, of course, interest rates are still a little high. Shrinkflation and greed from the corporate overlords in this country is a little excessive, and that's what's keeping grocery prices so high. Housing prices are still too high, but wages are outpacing inflation. Unemployment has been below 4% for the longest streak in 60 years. And all of those major pieces of legislation, including bringing back the manufacture of chips and semiconductors to the United States with the CHIPS Act, is brilliant. The PACT Act, the Build Back Better Act, the American Rescue Plan. And again, the list goes on and on and on. The first meaningful gun reform in this nation in 30 years. That's a lot. That was a lot packed into one term. So your legacy is secure unless you remain hard-headed about this and somehow we end up losing in January and you do nothing and allow Donald Trump to actually take the oath of office and become president. Then we have a real problem. It's going to be a problem for anyone who's not already wealthy by that date. It will become impossible to fill your kitchen with groceries for anything resembling what you do today. With the tariffs promised by Trump, inflation will be at 20 or 30% in this country. Interest rates on a home will be over 25%. This man is talking about taking a sledgehammer to government, taking a sledgehammer to economics, taking a sledgehammer to everything, just because Joe Biden did it, even though it has been extremely successful, even talking about rolling back the gains made when the U.S. government won the right to negotiate with Medicare over drug prices, so that now insulin is capped at $35 a month for seniors. No more price gouging. No more abusing the American public the way Donald Trump would undoubtedly allow to happen. And as for these billionaires throwing him some money so that they don't have to pay any taxes, for one, that's repulsive and repugnant. It's also unpatriotic. It's almost treasonous, considering the stakes and considering what this man has promised to do to the United States of America. If you look at international polling about the U.S. election, for people who are really plugged in to politics, as we follow the elections that go on in Germany, the elections that go on in Italy and France, and of course the most recent that just happened in France, and the recent election that happened in Great Britain, we pay attention to. And Biden leads by 10 to 30 points because the rest of the world would rather have a man who doesn't know where he is and can't speak clearly and jams sentences together, smashes words together so that it's indiscernible. We really don't know what you even just said, Joe. And to pull out the racism card and say that because the majority of the Congressional Black Caucus supports you, and you had such major support from black people, black Americans, in the 2020 presidential Democratic primary, that you should remain the standard bearer for the party going into the 2024 election. That's a bit ludicrous. That's a bit nuts. But there is hope. There is hope because I believe that, again, place a generic candidate, Gretchen Whitmer, Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom. Imagine Gavin Newsom on a debate stage or Kamala Harris on a debate stage with Donald Trump, a man who obviously is suffering from his own mental problems, has all of the comorbidities to go with it, being obese, with all of the terrible habits he has, on top of the fact he's almost 80 years old. He is not all there. There's no way. I mean, if you watched or paid any attention to his trials this year, you would know that the man is not 100%. Well, he's not even 60%. So to look worse than Donald Trump, I mean, it almost takes work to look that bad. And we simply can't have that going in to the election of our lifetimes. Perhaps the most important election in the history of the United States, because the very democracy on which it was found is on the line. This has been a short episode. Again, it was not a very eventful news day. Our hearts are with those people who are suffering mightily in the places that have been flooded by Hurricane Beryl. Sorry, terribly sorry that this is happening to you. It's a terrible, terrible thing, especially in this kind of heat. And, well, we hope the best for our democracy and for the United States moving forward, that we continue on this march towards fairness and equality, and that we're not slid backward into the 1920s. For women, for minorities, for anyone who's not super wealthy. We hope that we can pull this thing together, and that the only person who can really, really make sure that this country doesn't fall into the hands of a deranged lunatic, a Hitler-like figure, only older and fatter, and Donald Trump doesn't take control and become essentially a default dictator on day one, is you, President Biden. You are the only person who can do that. And again, it would probably be best done by stepping down, by stepping aside and saying, next up, that I'll be here through January, that I'll be here as sort of an overseer and a protector of the country, but it's time for new blood. And it pains me to say this, but it is time. There's no way to escape the constant news cycle that will be your age, your mental acuity, the Parkinson's stories that have come out from the White House logs, the visitors' logs that were released. There's no escaping it. So, give that some thought as we approach your comments this evening after the NATO summit and your press conference, hoping that there are as few gaffes as possible, but the inevitable gaffes will come, and when they do, we hope that, again, you seriously consider giving someone else the opportunity while there's still time for them to mount a serious campaign against a demented madman. I mean, your vice president polls just 2 points behind Donald Trump, and I don't know about state-to-state polling, but I'm willing to bet she's probably ahead in a few of those key swing states, all of which you are now losing. Again, I'm speaking directly to the Commander-in-Chief, President Joseph Robinette Biden. And well, that does it from us here at the Magnolia Media Podcast. Again, I'm your host, Jonathan M. Ruggiero. Please check us out on Patreon by going to patreon.com/Magnolia Media Network. Because after all, we're trying to grow a network here, the South's first truly progressive network, or at least left of center network. And check out my social media, especially my Instagram, at Magnolia John 2024. It's also the same on Threads, and it's Magnolia John if you're looking for me on Twitter X. I do not have a blue check mark, and I do not intend on paying Elon Musk for one anytime soon. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Magnolia Media Podcast. Until next time, be well